The claim that $2.5 trillion is missing from the Pentagon needs a reality check first. It's not that money vanished into thin air. What's actually being referenced is the Department of Defense's long-running accounting problems. The Pentagon has indeed failed multiple audits in a row, but those failures point to incomplete tracking systems and documentation gaps, not a confirmed pile of lost cash. That distinction matters because missing suggests theft or disappearance, while audits usually flag poor record keeping and outdated financial systems. That said, the frustration behind the statement is real. Year after year, the Pentagon struggles to fully account for its massive budget, and critics argue that this weakens trust. When an organization handles trillions over time, even small tracking errors can scale into huge numbers on paper. Still, that's very different from saying trillions are gone. The comparison to USAID also adds another layer. United States Agency for International Development operates in a completely different space, focused on global aid and development. Discussions about restructuring or shutting down agencies like that tend to be political and policy-driven, not directly tied to Pentagon audit outcomes. So linking the two as if they're handled the same way can be misleading. As for Congressman Jared MosKowitz, moments like the one you're describing often gain traction because they simplify a complicated issue into a sharp, TV-ready point. He essentially flipped the narrative by highlighting the contrast, questioning why one area faces intense scrutiny while another, far larger system continues operating despite repeated audit failures. In the end, the core issue isn't just about numbers. It's about accountability, transparency, and whether institutions handling enormous budgets are being held to consistent standards. That's the real debate people are reacting to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kaplan, you spoke about issues and accountability at the UN and mentioned that we should tighten mandatory disclosure requirements and add clear consequences for failure to comply. Can you provide some more details on what you think that should look like, and would you recommend additional auditing and transparency tools?
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. It's just a constant source of frustration. It should frustrate every single American taxpayer where money is going to the United Nations, where money continues to go to UN agencies. Again, they're a one bucket of recipient. You have UN agencies, NGOs, and contractors. When it comes to the UN, we have the least enforcement remedies available. We have the least access and the least transparency in that. So I think there's absolutely means to tighten up. In the 2024 Appropriations Act, there's a specific clause, Section 7048, if you're keeping score at home, that requires the Secretary of State to seek to implement in all agreements with the UN access for the USAID IG, State IG, and GAO. That is essential, and failure to comply with that should either result in not receiving an award or reward remedies for noncompliance.
All right, well, I appreciate that, and I agree. I want to go with this logic for a second that because there was waste, fraud, and abuse in USAID, we should get rid of it, right? Which, that was the argument. I assume you would agree that in a $7 trillion budget, we could probably find, in fact, we have found waste, fraud, and abuse in every department, right?
That's why you have inspectors general to root it out.
That's right. So there's waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon, right?
Correct.
And there's waste, fraud, and abuse in DHS.
Yes.
In fact, we just saw the other day $200 million, right, to be spent on advertising, right? That sounds like a waste to me. I mean, it was more money that was spent on the last Jurassic Park movie or one of the Lord of the Rings movies or one of the Harry Potter movies. I think the Barbie movie was less expensive. In fact, I think every movie except one that was nominated for an Oscar was less expensive than what Kristi Noem spent. To spend $200 million, Kristi Noem, and not get nominated by an Oscar, I think shows their liberal bias. So there's definitely waste, right? But no one's talking about getting rid of those places. No one's talking about, just because we're spending, $9 million on crab legs in the Pentagon or $220 million on furniture in the Pentagon or, $100,000 on a Steinway piano in the Pentagon. No one's talking about getting rid of the Pentagon just because there's waste, fraud, and abuse, right? That would be unreasonable, Mr. Kaplan. You agree?
No one's talking about getting rid of those agencies.
Right, of course, right? So it would be, and that's where the disconnect is here, is that somehow because this agency, no different than all the other agencies, we could sit, HUD, Department of Agriculture, we could go through them, right? There's waste, fraud, and abuse, and we owe it to the American people, by the way, to eliminate that waste, fraud, and abuse. There's no excuse for that, okay? We owe it to them. But in the search of trying to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't mean we should get rid of an entire agency. No, we should eliminate the waste, fraud, and abuse from those agencies, because all of these agencies still have important functions. Obviously, the Pentagon, we're not getting rid of the Pentagon, even though they haven't been able to pass an audit 8 years in a row. There's over $2.5 trillion, let me say that again, over $2.5 trillion missing in the Pentagon, like real money, okay? And no one's talking about getting rid of it. And so, that's the function of the problem I have. Look, in my own household budget, right? I can tell you my kids are definitely, there's tons of waste in my family budget based on what my kids like to spend, okay? There's definitely abuse going on. And based on the amount of boxes that show up at my house every day, my wife is definitely committing fraud, okay? But the point is, I'm not getting rid of these people, right? What am I going to do? I'm going to sit them down at the kitchen table, and I'm going to say, we need to spend less, right? What are we spending on? We didn't have that conversation here with USAID. We never got to say, hey, look, these programs, delete them. These things, get rid of them, okay? Every other agency somehow is getting that benefit of the doubt, right? We're giving that benefit of the doubt to the Pentagon. I want to end with this. Now that these functions are going to move over to the State Department, all right, Mr. Kaplan, do you think the State Department has the resources, the personnel to do all of this oversight, the grant oversight, to the capacity to handle all of this without adding more personnel to the State Department?
Let me begin with this, Congressman MosKowitz. I can assure you that the same vile predators that sought to steal from USAID or divert funds to terrorist organizations or sexually abuse minors like they did in the Ebola response will try to do the same thing at state.
Yeah, and look, that's all terrible. We all support, clamping down on that and getting rid of it. My question is, do you think the State Department at this juncture needs additional resources now that they have all this additional responsibility?
Contrary to media reports, foreign assistance programs are not dead, and there are billions and billions and billions of dollars now being spent and administered by not only State Department,
my
but
time is up. I'm just trying to get an answer. So, okay, yes, I'm with you. But do you now think that now that that is all moved over to the State Department, do they need more resources to limit the fraud, waste, and abuse? Because otherwise, aren't we going to wind up in the same situation where there's going to be fraud, waste, and abuse because we're not investing in that oversight?
Maximum oversight is essential, and that's what we brought as the IG for USAID. And when you have billions going out in complex emergency environments and money spent overseas in areas controlled by terrorist organizations and any armed group, you need adequate staffing, people, good monitoring, and an effective IG to oversee and investigate any misuse of those funds.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me say it again, because this is where the frustration begins. The Pentagon has failed audit after audit, year after year, for nearly a decade. The most powerful military organization on Earth still cannot fully account for how its massive budget is tracked. Not billions, trillions pass through systems that auditors say remain incomplete, inconsistent, and at times unreliable. And yet, the conversation rarely matches the scale of that problem. We hear outrage about waste elsewhere, about smaller programs, isolated fraud cases, or questionable spending. But when it comes to the Pentagon, where reports highlight overpriced items, inefficient contracts, and billions in adjustments, the response feels quieter. That contrast is exactly what critics are pointing to. Now compare that to how quickly other agencies become targets. United States Agency for International Development, an organization known for humanitarian work, fighting hunger, preventing disease, and building global relationships, can suddenly find itself under intense scrutiny. The question isn't whether waste exists anywhere. It does, everywhere. The real question is consistency. That's the point Congressman Jared MosKowitz highlighted so sharply. If waste, fraud, and abuse are reasons to shut something down, then why apply that standard selectively? Why do some institutions face immediate backlash while others continue operating under the same concerns? Because at the end of the day, this debate isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It's about priorities. It's about which systems we choose to challenge and which ones we don't. So the real question isn't just where the money goes. It's why the accountability conversation seems to change depending on who's being asked.